What I'm about to tell you happened 3 months ago, and I still wake up in cold sweats every night. My friend Jake and I were driving cross country when a massive storm hit out of nowhere, forcing us to find shelter immediately. The only place with a vacancy was an old roadside motel with a flickering neon sign that read, "Moonlight in Vacancy." The building looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s, with peeling paint and broken windows. But we were desperate. As we pulled into the gravel parking lot, I noticed something strange. There were no other cars, yet the no vacancy light wasn't on. The storm was getting worse by the minute, lightning illuminating the motel's cracked facade, and we had no choice but to stay the night. What happened in room 6 will make you never want to stay in a roadside motel again, because some places are designed to trap travelers forever. The reception area smelled like old cigarettes and mildew with water stain, wallpaper peeling off the walls in long strips. Behind the counter sat the oldest man I'd ever seen, skin paper thin and his eyes completely white, as if he'd been blind for decades. When I rang the bell on the counter, he slowly looked up, but never made eye contact. Just stared at a point somewhere behind my left shoulder. His voice was barely a whisper when he said, "Room 6 is available. But you must follow one rule. Never, under any circumstances, open the curtains after midnight." He slid a tarnished brass key across the counter with fingers so cold they felt like ice when they brushed mine. I asked him why we couldn't open the curtains, but he just repeated the warning and pointed toward a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. As we walked away, I heard him whisper something that made my blood run cold. They've been waiting so long for new guests. Room 6 was at the very end of the hallway, and with each step we took, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees until we could see our own breath in the air. The carpet beneath our feet was soaked despite being indoors, squelching with each step, and the wallpaper showed dark stains that looked suspiciously like handprints reaching toward the ceiling. When Jake inserted the key, the door swung open on its own with a prolonged creak that echoed down the empty hallway. The room was frozen in time. A rotary phone sat on the nightstand. The television had rabbit ear antennas, and the bed was covered with a faded floral bedspread that reeked of mothballs and something else I couldn't identify. But the most unsettling feature was the large window covered by thick, heavy curtains that seemed to move slightly, even though there was no breeze in the room. As we unpacked our bags, the old television suddenly flickered to life, showing nothing but static, and through the white noise, we could swear we heard voices whispering our names. We tried to sleep, but the room felt alive around us. The floorboards creaked as if someone was walking back and forth. The pipes in the walls groaned and gurgled, and that damn television kept turning itself on and off throughout the night. At 11:58 p.m., I was watching the digital clock on my phone when the temperature in the room plummeted so drastically that frost began forming on the windows. Jake was snoring softly in the bed next to mine when I heard it, a slow, deliberate knocking on the window. 3 taps followed by a pause, then 3 more taps. My heart started racing because I remembered we were on the 2nd floor, and there was no balcony or fire escape outside our window. The knocking continued, growing, more insistent, and the heavy curtains began to sway as if something on the other side was pressing against the glass. I grabbed Jake's shoulder and shook him awake, whispering urgently about the knocking. But when he sat up to listen, the sound stopped completely, leaving us in an eerie silence that felt more terrifying than any noise could have been. At exactly 12:03 a.m., curiosity got the better of me, and despite the old man's warning, I slowly approached the window and reached for the edge of the curtain. The fabric felt ice cold and damp to the touch, and as I began to pull it aside, just an inch, Jake grabbed my wrist with a grip so tight it left bruises. "Don't," he whispered, his voice shaking with fear. "Can't you see the shadow?" I looked where he was pointing and saw the distinct silhouette of a person standing directly outside our second-story window, perfectly still and unnaturally tall, with what appeared to be long, thin arms that reached down past where normal legs should. And the shadow wasn't moving, just standing there as if waiting for us to open the curtains completely. We backed away from the window, but the shadow remained, and we could hear it breathing, slow, labored breathing that seemed to fog up the glass from the outside. For the rest of the night, we sat on our beds, fully clothed, watching that motionless shadow and listening to the rhythmic breathing that never stopped, never changed pace, just continued until the first rays of dawn began to creep across the sky, just as we thought we might survive until morning. Jake noticed something that made our situation infinitely worse. The television screen wasn't showing static anymore, but a live feed of our exact room. It's filmed from an angle that would be impossible unless there was a camera hidden in the ceiling directly above our beds. We could see ourselves on the screen in real time, sitting on the beds in terror. And when Jake waved his hand, his image on the screen waved back with a slight delay. On the screen, a tall, pale woman in a tattered white dress standing between our beds, smiling directly into the camera with teeth that were far too sharp and far too numerous for any human mouth. We spun around to look at the space between our beds, but saw nothing there, yet on the screen, the woman was reaching out toward my image with fingers that seemed to stretch like rubber. I grabbed the remote and tried to turn off the television, but it wouldn't respond. Then the woman on the screen began to mouth words we couldn't hear but somehow understood. "You can never leave room 6. At 4:17 a.m., we couldn't take it anymore and decided to make a run for it, grabbing our bags and rushing toward the door. But when Jake turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the outside, and our key wouldn't work in reverse. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped, and the breathing outside the window was getting louder and more aggressive, accompanied by what sounded like fingernails scraping against the glass. In desperation, Jake threw his shoulder against the door repeatedly until it finally burst open, and we ran down that endless hallway as fast as we could, our footsteps echoing behind us like gunshots. But as we ran, we could hear other doors opening along the hallway, and glimpses of other guests, or what used to be guests, standing in their doorways. All of them pale and motionless, with that same impossibly wide smile. The old man wasn't at the reception desk when we burst through the lobby, but we could hear his voice coming from everywhere at once, saying, "Checkout time isn't until noon, and you haven't paid for your stay." We didn't stop running until we reached our car, and as we drove away, I looked back to see every window in the motel glowing with an unnatural light, and silhouettes standing behind every curtain, watching us leave. We drove straight through to the next town without stopping, our hands shaking and our minds struggling to process what we'd experienced. The next morning, we decided to research the moonlight and online, thinking we should report what happened to the authorities. But we couldn't find any record of a motel by that name anywhere along our route. Google Maps showed nothing but empty fields for miles in the area where we'd stopped, and when we called the local police department, somebody told us there hadn't been a motel in that stretch of highway for over 30 years, not since the Moonlight Inn burned down in 1987, killing all 15 guests who were staying there that night. The police report stated that the guests' bodies were never found, just their belongings in their rooms, as if they had simply vanished into thin air. But the detail that made my blood freeze was that all of them had been staying in rooms with windows facing the parking lot, and every single curtain had been found wide open. We tried to convince ourselves it was all a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress until we got home and unpacked our bags. At the bottom of my duffel bag, wrapped in one of my t-shirts, was a tarnished brass key with a tag that read Room 6, Moonlighting. And attached to it was a note in handwriting that looked exactly like mine, but which I never wrote. Thanks for staying with us. Your room will always be ready for your return. Asterisk, I still have that key. Every night at 3 a.m., I get a phone call from a number that doesn't exist. And when I answer, I hear that same old man's voice saying, "Your checkout time has been extended." Have you ever stayed somewhere that felt like it didn't want to let you leave?